mean, I think on some level, American policy is a red herring. The U.S. is 15% of global emissions, and we're falling. The future climate of the world will be determined by China, by India, by sub-Saharan Africa. Those are carbon footprints that are growing. China's now almost twice as big a carbon footprint as the U.S., and they're building all this infrastructure outside of China that doesn't even count in Asia and Africa, the Belt and Road, this project. So basically taking the model that the U.S. had with like the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, and they're building the infrastructure of the developing world. So recently they loaned Kenya a huge amount of money to build a new rail line, which was being built with Chinese workers. They built the rail line. Then Kenya couldn't pay back the debt. So China is threatening to take over the entire port of Mombasa as debt repayment. And this is like going on all around the world. Highways across Africa, across Asia are being built by Chinese workers in an effort to build a new imperial infrastructure for themselves.
And is the thought that they're doing this in terms of setting up the debt in a way that's unpayable so that they could take over?
That's one motive.
Yeah.
I think that the Kenya example, but they'd be happy if the debt got repaid. I think they're stitching together an alternative to the Western infrastructure of trade and transit. They're basically stitching together an entire second system of how the world will work, how the economy will work, and it will be conducted through their own infrastructure and through their own ports and through their own airports. And that's being done by their own standards. So China is now pouring more concrete every 3 years than the U.S. poured in the entire 20th century.
Jesus Christ.
And if concrete were a country, it would be the world's third biggest carbon emitter. So the path of development of these other countries, China, India, and sub-Saharan Africa, are really what's going to be writing the story of the future. America has a kind of, I think, like a moral obligation to lead because historically we had the biggest carbon footprint, but at the moment we're a relatively small part of the problem. And within the U.S., market forces are making a lot of progress for us. So the real issue is how do we figure out a new geopolitics that forces countries like China to act better? And one answer may be, as weird as it is to say, that Xi Jinping is basically a dictator. If he wants to impose new standards, if he wants to invest aggressively in green energy, he doesn't have any of the political obstacles that we have in the U.S. And so there's this sort of weird sympathy among American climate people for that authoritarianism. And he has, especially since Trump has been elected, been a lot more aggressive about talking about climate because he sees if America's not going to be leading, this is an opportunity for China to be like the real face of climate. And that means they've invested a ton in solar and wind. They've done a lot with air pollution. So Beijing used to be really awful. In 2013, I think more than 1 million Chinese people died of air pollution. And now that's much better.
What have they done?
Just imposing stricter standards on pollution.
So emissions, coal plants, things like that.
That kind of stuff, yeah. And but we think about carbon and the whole problem, I think, a little too much in terms of energy. Energy is just 30% of the global carbon footprint, and it's the easiest one to solve because wind and solar is actually really cheap now. Most parts of the world is cheaper than dirty energy.
What's the majority of the footprint?
Well, nothing's a majority. But okay. So there's energy, there's infrastructure, there's transportation, and agriculture is like a huge underappreciated part of it. It's something like, 30% of the global footprint. And
is it because of tractors or what is it because of?
Everything.
Everything that you need to do to run a farm.
I mean, really everything you need to do to live in the world has some kind of carbon footprint. But, if we were able to feed all our cattle seaweed, that would have a big impact. But all kinds of crops have carbon footprints,
but they would still have to do something to get the seaweed and have the seaweed travel, the seaweed deliver it to these farms.
Well, you could also do, you could imagine lab grown meat having a much smaller carbon footprint. It should if it proceeds as we expect it will. And like I said before, when you look at each particular threat, there's you can see reasons for optimism. You can see we'll figure it out in this way, we'll figure it out in that way. But the UN says we need to have all of our global emissions by 2030 to have a chance of averting 2 degrees of warming, which they call catastrophic warming. And the projects that we need to put into place in those 11 years are just much bigger than I think we're capable of pulling off. They say, the UN says, what is necessary is a global mobilization at the level of World War II against climate starting this year, 2019. And there's just no chance that we're going to do that anytime soon. I mean, maybe 10 years from now we'll get there. That may even be optimistic. But the total decarbonization that's required is we need to totally zero out on carbon by 2050, they say. And I just think, a lot of these sectors are much trickier. We could maybe zero out on carbon when it comes to energy in 15 years if we wanted to. But again, that's just 30% of the total problem. Which is why I think there's the negative emission stuff, the carbon capture is so important, because it will allow us to move more slowly than the UN says we need to, and still, if it works out, keep the planet relatively stable, relatively livable. But that's, those technologies have been called magical thinking by like the Journal of Nature, which is like the biggest scientific journal, writing about this stuff. So it's sort of a leap of faith to think that they could solve that problem.
Do you think that we're dealing with like shifts in degrees of perception, that it's things like your book, things like Al Gore's movie, things like, anytime there's a news story that's written in the New York Times or in any periodical, we need more of this. It needs to be hammered home to people. It needs to be something that's a global discussion that accelerates.
Totally. And I think that that's happening. I think there was this big report that the UN did in October that spurred a lot of conversation about it. And I think that in a grotesque way, the best teacher is just extreme weather.
Right.
When you see every year these California wildfires, every year they're burning, and that is really dramatic. People I talk to in Europe are focused on the California fires. Even though they have wildfires over there, there's something about the California fires that they're really worried about. When you see these global heat waves, when you see unprecedented hurricane seasons, we just had a typhoon in the Pacific in February, first time in recorded history. When every day on the news there's some dramatic extreme weather, and when they come one after the other, I think that's a really powerful teaching tool. So there's this term, it's now outdated, but 500-year storm you hear a lot about. 500-year storm means a hurricane that would hit a particular area once every 5 centuries, right? That means 5 centuries ago, there were no white people in America. So that means we're talking about a storm that would come once as colonists came to America, as they, committed genocide against the Native Americans, as they built their own empire, as they built an empire of slaves and cotton, as they fought a civil war, as they fought World War I, as they fought World War II. Everything that we've done, we'd expect one storm of that kind in that time. Hurricane Harvey was the third 500-year storm to hit Houston in 3 years. We are living in such unprecedented climate that it's impossible to look at the news and not learn that. Despite all of our inclinations, all of our reflexes to look away, I think it is seeping in. I think people are beginning to be more alarmed about it. And I think alarm is really useful. There are people in the climate community who think, it's dangerous to scare people. It turns them off. But I'm somebody who's awakened to this out of fear. And when I look at the history of environmental activism, when I look at activism generally, it's like we don't try to get people to stop smoking cigarettes by like messaging through optimism. We try to get them to stop because we tell them how bad it's going to be for them. Drunk driving, nuclear proliferation, same thing. Rachel Carson, wrote Silent Spring about pesticides. It was called Hyperbolic Alarmist. It led to the creation of the EPA. And, when you think about that UN directive that we should be mobilizing at the scale of World War II to combat climate, we didn't fight World War II out of hope. We fought World War II out of panic. And I think that should be part of how we think about this story, obviously. I think, when I look around the world, when I talk to anyone, when I talk to my family, when I watch TV, when I watch read stuff, it just seems obvious to me that there are many more people who are still too complacent about this issue. Even if they're concerned about it a little bit, even if they're aware of it, they don't think of it as like the overarching, all-encompassing story of our time that requires an existential response. And even saying those words make me uncomfortable because it's hard for me to believe that the threat is that big. But that is what the science says. And like I said before, some of that science is not going to get borne out. But when you look at the full scope of it and just how large, just how bleak the impacts will be, you realize like we really need to wake up to just how dangerous a world we're heading into and do everything we can to avoid it, in addition to probably planning to adapt.